So in recent years, the length of this lever has become quite a hot topic. In this video, we're going to try and talk you through the do's and don'ts around selecting crank length to best suit your position. My name's Lee Prescott, I'm the lead fitter here at Velo Atelier, and I'm also the president for the IBFI. Stick around to find out what crank length you should be on. So why has crank length become such a hot topic recently? I think there's a few factors around that. Firstly, there's been a few very high profile professional riders using shorter cranks, which has spurred on a bigger interest in why. And also, I think more and more bikes, specifically production bikes, have become more aggressive and positions have become more aggressive in recent years, which has meant that people that have then tried shorter cranks have often discovered that it's alleviated issues they've been having with hip discomfort or knee discomfort in these more aggressive positions. I don't think, as we often get asked here in the studio, that shorter cranks are necessarily a go-to for everybody. There's a reason to use them, and there's also some reasons not to. So some of the common misconceptions around crank length are, things like short cranks are only for pros, or that crank length has massive impact on power production, or that crank length can be looked at independently of saddle height. They're intimately linked, and you always need to look at the two together. So I'm going to go through a few things that you need to consider when you're trying to decide which is your next crank length. So traditionally, crank length was always selected based on essentially height. And there's an element of truth to that. Crank length should be looked at proportionally with the rider. If you're 5 foot, then having a shorter crank is only proportionally the same as someone who's 6 foot having a longer crank. The end result is going to be almost identical. So you need to consider anthropomorphics, or kind of height and body proportions when selecting your crank length, but it's not the sole consideration as it used to be. I think the modern take on choosing crank length is that crank length should be used as a fitting tool. Okay, there's a guy, an esteemed chap called Jim Martin, who has researched crank length since the 80s. Lots of big papers. I've sat through his talks many times over the years, and all of his research is fairly well proven that crank length has no real impact on power production. So the length of the crank really is just a tool for a bike fitter to put you into the most stable and efficient position. So as a fitter, being able to choose the appropriate crank length for the end goal is the key for us, not solely worrying about power production. And I think the key thing there is, people's crank length will change depending on their end goal. You don't necessarily have to have the same crank on all of your bikes. You need to consider what you're using that bike for and how it's going to be used. I, for instance, have a different crank length from my gravel bike to my road bike because the way I use them is different, and the naturally self-selected cadence I use on those bikes is different because the terrain I'm using them on is different. Likewise with World Tour Pros, you might find that someone who's riding, say, Paris-Roubaix and riding over cobbles will select a longer crank arm so they can pedal at a slightly lower cadence and hover over the saddle more, versus World Tour, Grand Tour riders selecting shorter cranks because they're doing lots of climbing in the saddle. So I guess to understand crank length, we should consider actually what crank length changes. The shorter the crank or the lever here in this already fairly complex system of levers simply means that for a smaller crank arm, the foot or the pedal is going in a smaller diameter circle. That means that the knee doesn't come up as high at the top of the pedal stroke, and also it doesn't extend quite as much at the bottom of the pedal stroke. This is why saddle height or saddle distance from the crank arms needs to be fitted in line with what length crank you have. If you're fitting a new, smaller or longer crank to a bike, the saddle height needs to be changed to suit. So for instance, with a shorter crank arm, the circumference of that circle is going to be smaller, which means the knee is going to come up less height, which is going to close this hip angle less. So if you have issues with your hips, having a shorter crank arm is really useful because it just means you're not closing that up as much. Also, if you're in a really aggressive position, a smaller crank arm is good because it allows the torso to rotate further forwards whilst still being able to maintain a comfortable, smooth pedal stroke. So you need to select the crank arm based on some of these factors. In terms of power production, as we have already mentioned, power output and crank length doesn't have a huge correlation. What tends to happen is for a shorter crank arm, the individual will typically self-select an appropriate cadence that normally gives almost identical power output to a previous crank length. So cadence will typically rise slightly with a shorter crank arm, which is probably one of the reasons why we're getting increasingly wide ratio cassettes on the rear of the bike as well, to give you kind of the ability to ride at those higher cadences. One of the typical things that people often refer back to is kind of a loss of leverage by having a shorter crank arm. And I guess there can potentially be a small loss of leverage, but it's so minute that it's typically not noticeable apart from on very kind of short, low cadence kind of sprint efforts. So if I was setting up a bike for a track sprinter, I wouldn't potentially be putting a really short crank on there because the leverage at the start is really important. But for most people riding general day-to-day, having a slightly higher cadence is not a bad thing. So who out there would normally benefit from a slightly smaller crank? Firstly, I guess the obvious one is smaller riders. So that just proportionally the circumference of their pedalling circle is more appropriate to their entire height. You've also then got people with any sort of dysfunction in the hip who wants to reduce the amount of that closed hip angle. You've then also got riders who are going to be getting into very aggressive positions like time trialists, crit racers, that sort of thing, where a high cadence is also beneficial for things like muscle velocity. And I guess finally, triathletes and some gravel riders now as well will benefit from shorter cranks, but for different reasons. Gravel riders and mountain bikers have known this for years, quite like shorter cranks because it gives them higher ground clearance, the ability to corner whilst pedalling more. And then triathletes benefit from it because the leg is going through a smaller movement, hence the run is going to be more easily worked into, and the cadence on the bike is going to be more akin to maybe their running cadence. So what are the downsides to shorter cranks? I guess firstly, if you naturally pedal at a lower cadence, I'd say kind of below 70, firstly, you probably want to watch out for that anyway, because that's putting a huge amount of torque through your knee joints. But at lower cadences, you will potentially notice a small reduction in power. At normal kind of standard cadences between 80 and 100, it'll be very difficult to notice any discernible drop because you'll just self-select. The other thing to consider is that if you are moving from a longer crank to a shorter crank, your muscle recruitment will be different. You'll be using the muscles slightly differently because the pattern of the movement will be different. So bear that in mind. There may be a small adaptation period required for everything to sort of feel smooth and normal again. But typically that's going to be within, 3 or 4 rides or a couple of weeks of riding. So I think the key kind of summary of all of this stuff is, crank length alone isn't a magic bullet. It's not in itself going to massively improve your power output or speed or any of that stuff. You should consider it as a bike fitting tool, just like selecting the correct stem length. It should be selected to suit you, your type of riding and your functional ability. I think if you have any issues with your hips, or you're wanting to get into a very aggressive position, especially for a long period of time, so people doing half and full distance Ironmen, for instance, then a shorter crank can be a really useful tool for you. So I hope that's been useful. If you've got any further questions on crank length, and I'm sure there'll be some, please feel free to leave those in the comments below and we'll aim to get back to you. If anyone wants to try shorter cranks, just consider whether the benefits that we've outlined are going to be worth that expenditure. Don't jump into it unnecessarily.